Okay, let's get started. So welcome everyone to this workshop on stakeholder capitalism with Dr. R. Edward Freeman. In this workshop, we're going to look at the case for stakeholder approach. The approach is growing, but how do you actually do it? And so we have Dr. Freeman here to get us started. And he says, call me Ed. So that's what we're going to do today. So we've just had a lot of really great sessions over the last day and a half. Yesterday morning, we started out talking about Scotland with Jonathan Coburn and Neil McLean, and they were talking about social enterprise as being having so many different forms of organizations that in fact we should really be thinking about social entrepreneurship and how we act together. And then this morning we had two finance professors talking about the perspective from a financial markets and investors perspective. And so now we're coming around full circle and coming back to what do organizations look like in social enterprise logic. And this is where taking a stakeholder approach is really valuable. So I'm going to then, yes, I'll start with our land acknowledgement. So I am joining this virtual event from the University of Calgary, which is situated on the land adjacent to where the Bow River meets the Elbow River, and that the traditional Blackfoot name of this place is Mohkinstsis, which we now call the city of Calgary. We have many attendees from Canada and beyond, so please share with us where you are joining from in the chat. My name is Alice de Koning, and I'm a faculty member here at the Haskayne School of Business. I am also the academic director at the Hunter Hub for Entrepreneurial Thinking at the University of Calgary. My interest in social entrepreneurship was probably initially spurred both by compassion for people in need, but also by students who really wanted to think more about entrepreneurship from a perspective of purpose. And so I've increasingly been more engaged in that from the perspective of strategy and entrepreneurship. My most recent work is looking at how do we create business models that are appropriate and useful for social enterprises. So let me introduce Dr. Freeman before we get into in depth of this. Oh yeah, sorry. We have to talk about social media. So if you're going to tweet out anything in social media or post in LinkedIn, we're just going to be asking you to use the hashtag POP2021 so that we can share your snippets. And that would be wonderful for us. And also just so everyone is aware that the session will be simultaneously translated into French. So if that's an option that's meaningful to you, please do click into that. So Dr. Ed Freeman is a prolific educator. He's a consultant and a speaker, very well known for his work on the topics of stakeholder management and business ethics. He also teaches leading with meaning and helps organizations create a culture that brings out the best in everyone. Freeman is best known perhaps for his award-winning book, Strategic Management, A Stakeholder Approach, which was first published in 1984 and reissued in 2010 by Cambridge University Press. It was and is a landmark book and is said to have helped define and shape our understanding of how good management practice is really based on relationships. Relationships with the stakeholders who both comprise and affect or are affected by the business. Ed Freeman joined the Darden Graduate School of Business Administration in 1987, where he is currently the university professor and Ellis and Zinn Olsen Professor of Business Administration. Concurrently, he serves with many different universities and institutes as a leading academic in management and ethics. And if you'd like to know more about him, I encourage you to go on the internet. He has been honored for his research contributions around the world, and he has been recognized for excellence in teaching by both his peers and his students. And we certainly appreciate his generosity in spending time with us today. So let me just quickly go over the agenda. What we have decided on is that Ed Freeman will present for about 30 minutes, giving an overall shape to our workshop. And then we will go into breakout groups for to interact with each other and to discuss the concepts. And we have some questions prepared to facilitate that discussion, and then come back for another half hour to debrief and to ask other questions with Ed Freeman. So if there's no further questions, then I will invite Ed to take the microphone.
Thanks, Alice. It's very nice to be here with you, even though it's virtual. One of my great joys of the last couple of years was getting to come to Calgary, and I'm not a Canadian, but I absolutely am an incredible hockey fan. So being able to go to the Saddle Dome was really terrific. And my team's the Nashville Predators, if anybody wants to hop on board the Predators fan train. I want to talk for a little bit. We just did a book called The Power of And, Responsible Business Without Trade-Offs. And in The Power of And, our argument is that there's a new story of business that's emerging. It's emerging all over the world. Many of you are a part of it as you've taken on this idea of doing social entrepreneurship. Now, I was at a meeting in the waning days of the Obama administration. I was at a meeting in the White House, and we were talking about what it was all the people who had proposed changes in the way we think about capitalism. People from conscious capitalism, inclusive capitalism, capitalism 2.0, people who did impact investing, ESG investing, people who represented social entrepreneurs, etc. Tom Perez, who was Secretary of Labor at the time, said, well, what's the right brand? And as I sat there, I thought, the right brand. I mean, everybody thought their brand was the right brand, of course, and they didn't realize my brand was the right brand. But no, that's I thought that wasn't the best question to ask. I thought a better question to ask was, well, regardless of how this shakes out, what are the 4 or 5 ideas that we have to deal with? And so we wrote this book. We think there are 5 of them. And I want to talk about 2 of them today, because I think they're especially relevant to you as social entrepreneurs or interested in social entrepreneurship. The first idea, I'm sure Alex talked about that this morning, is about purpose. And the second idea, of course, is about stakeholders. So I want to talk about each of those for a little bit. The other 3, by the way, are businesses need to deal with societal issues. And that's in part what many social entrepreneurs try to do, as well as market issues. And they need to see us in our full humanity, as well as economic beings. And we need to put ethics and business together. Those 3 ideas are important, but I want to talk about the other 2 for you today, and then give you some questions to think through with your own business, or if you don't have your own business, think through with a business that you're in, that you're interested in. And I've got basically, good news. I think the old story of business, there's no going back to it. And the old story, it's just about the money. It's just about shareholders. And business is roughly greedy little bastards out trying to do each other in and compete with each other, and they're all profit driven and that sort of stuff. Well, what we're trying to argue is that it's not purpose or profits. And it's not stakeholders or shareholders. That little three-letter word, is probably the most powerful word in the language. That business needs, for instance, purpose and profits. Many critics of business thinks profits are somehow bad or evil. But, business has to have profits to live, in the same way that I have to have red blood cells to live. But making red blood cells is not the purpose of my life. Making profits is not the purpose of a business, at least not without a lot more argument than the fact that business must have profits to live. And let's give our finance colleagues the benefit of the doubt. Business has to have profits at what they call the weighted average cost of capital, which is a complicated formula. It always works out to about 10%, but they get off on doing the complicated formula, and that's fine with me. I don't want to ruin that. But entrepreneurs, I dare say no one here, at least I hope it's true, no one here has started a business for the sole reason to make as much money as you can. You have to make money, or you won't be able to live. You won't be able to grow your business. But entrepreneurs start a business because they're on fire about something. There's something about the way you see the world that you want to share with everybody, that you want others to experience as well. And that's what drives, I think, at its heart, that's what drives our business system and what drives capitalism. Capitalism has a lot of baggage as a word. No surprise, Adam Smith never used the word. We pretty much got it from Marx. And that's like letting the Canadians dress the maple leaves. I don't think that would be a very good thing to have happen. And so, with all this baggage about capitalism, sometimes we forget that what really makes business go is the energy of entrepreneurs. Now, notice I said entrepreneurs, not social entrepreneurs, because I think it's easy to get stuck in this old story where, business is about the money and somehow that's bad. And then entrepreneurs are bad. They're questionable. And so we need something to feel better about this. So we call it social entrepreneurship. I'm of the view that being an entrepreneur is noble. Being an entrepreneur that works on societal issues is noble. And very few entrepreneurs that I know are in it just for the money. They've got some view of the world that they're on fire about. I have a friend who, longtime restaurateur in Copenhagen. The restaurant is called Noma, and it's often seen as the best restaurant in the world. And Klaus said to me, he said, we didn't start Noma to make as much money as we could, because we didn't make any for 19 years. Now he's made plenty since, so he's not hurting, and he's sold it and done other stuff. But Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, on fire about the computer revolution, and it's that passion is what drives entrepreneurs, not a passion to get rich. When I have students come to me and say, I'm going to start this business and then I'm going to build it and flip it and get rich, my advice to them is you better get a job, because building the business is actually really hard. So, okay, purpose and profits. Those things have to go together. Second one, it's not shareholders or stakeholders. It's both. What's the stakeholder idea? It's the simplest idea in the world. It just says, look, every business has always and will always create and sometimes destroy, but mostly create value for customers, suppliers, employees, communities, and the people with the money, the financiers, the shareholders, bondholders, banks, etc. What else could a business do? Businesses have been doing that for a long time. If you focus only on the money, you're going to miss the value that businesses have created for other stakeholders. The stakeholder idea is just, well, who are those groups that you can affect or can affect you? Or alternatively, who are those groups whose support you have to have? And at least customers, suppliers, employees, communities, and people with money are the ones that every business has to have their support. And maybe there are others as well, depending on your particular business. The stakeholder idea comes from the 1960s at two places, the Stanford Research Institute, where in those days, the way you did strategic planning was you looked for environmental trends, and they would put out a report that had like customer trends and supplier trends and employee trends. And as I'm told the story, they're sitting around one day trying to figure out what they're going to call these groups. And a technical writer, a woman, of course, made the following suggestion. She said, "You mean these stakeholders?" And everyone looked at it and said, "Yeah, that's exactly what we mean." She knew the word was an old Scottish word that was literally meant the people that hold the stakes in a gamble. So we're playing dice or cards or some gamble. We give the stakes to somebody else to hold. They're the stakeholder in that sense. And around the same time, a Swedish academic named Eric Renman, who is the father of industrial democracy in Sweden, wrote a book called Industrial Democracy in the Workplace and talked about intéressant in Swedish, which was translated as stakeholder. I think in French is parties prenant. That's a terrible accent, and I apologize. But it's a really simple idea, but there's several nuances and subtleties that I want to talk about. I want to talk about 5 of them very quickly. The first one is to say, many people think that the point of stakeholder theory is to say, look, it's not just shareholders, there are others. And that's true, but there's a more subtle point here. It's not just there's customers, suppliers, employees, communities, and shareholders. It's that these interests are intertwined with each other. They're interdependent. How you create value for one affects how you create value for the others. Now, it's important in thinking about purpose to think about for whom do you want to create value. And many people would say that's a part of our purpose statement or mission. But it's just as important to realize that if you do this for customers, it's going to have an effect on the others. So one way to say that is to say, look, the best way to think about profits is to think about it as an outcome of how you manage the relationships with customers, suppliers, employees, and communities. What you do with those groups will determine how much money you make and what kind of company you've got. So how you create value for one affects how you create value for the others. And this is a thing I find many companies don't understand. They understand the stakeholder idea and they understand stakeholder by stakeholder, but they don't understand the interaction. They don't understand, for instance, many of them don't understand how central employees are to the value that gets created for customers, suppliers, and community. Many don't understand the role of community in doing that as well. And so you have to put these interests together, and you don't have to align them in that they're the same. That's never going to happen. The metaphor I like is you got to get them in harmony. Harmony as a musical idea says, look, the notes are different, but they sound good together. And the trick is to get these stakeholder interests to sound good together. So sort of subtlety number one, stakeholders are, there's more than one, and they're interdependent. Number two means you shouldn't try to find trade-offs, because the idea is when you trade off one versus the other, yeah, that's one way of handling the interdependence. But what you're missing is a way.
Our direction
Right.
as far as the program goes,
Right.
right? And that's fine, that's
Yeah.
great.
Yep.
But I don't like who's on that list, and I would think we
Someone's talking there, so sorry, just a minute, get that out of my ear. The idea is you miss a kind of win-win opportunity. The story I would tell about this is some years ago, I'm listening to the CEO of a chemical company talk about, we're going to clean up the company, big company, going to take a generation or two to do this. But we're serious about it. They announced for zero pollution or some lofty goal. And they put in place a very business-like process. We're going to be here by this time, here by this time, here by this time. And he goes around making the speech to all the facilities about, we're serious about doing what we should for the environment. At one facility, the engineers come up to him and say, we can't meet this first interim goal. This plant equipment's too old, this process too dirty. We can't do it. CEO says, okay, well, I guess we'll have to shut the plant. You want to make a trade-off. Community on the one hand, that's where I would put the environment, employees on the other, community wins, employees lose. Let's shut the plant. Engineers go away. They come back several weeks later. A miracle has occurred. We figured it out. And the CEO says, well, what's it going to cost? And the engineer said, well, we're a little embarrassed. If we do it this new way, we're going to save money. What happened? What happened was when trade-offs are unacceptable, then you have to find win-wins. And you kick into gear the only real resource we human beings have. That's our creative imagination. And we figure out how to do things that maybe earlier looked impossible. So the first subtlety is stakeholders are interdependent, in addition to being more than one. The second one is we have to try to find win-wins. If all you look for is trade-offs, I can guarantee you all you're going to find is trade-offs. Sometimes you have to make them, but as soon as you have to make the trade-off, you have to ask yourself, how can I improve the trade-off for both sides? Third point, thinking about stakeholders means thinking about, as Alice has said this, but sometimes we don't always hear it, is thinking about relationships. And the difference is thinking about relationships versus thinking about transactions. One of the mistakes that we see in many ideas about business is we see business as a set of discrete transactions, unconnected with each other. When you're in a relationship with somebody, there's a presumption that it's going to continue. And you don't keep score all the time. My wife and I have been married for 44 years. We spent more time together the last 2 years, I think, than we did in the previous 42, and it worked out okay. But we spent a lot of time together during COVID. And if I were to walk into her office, which is right down the hall, and say, hey, babe, I've been thinking about the last 44 years, and I think you're up 3. I think you owe me 3. And I announced that was the score. I'm pretty sure I know what would happen with that. She's a second-degree black belt in Taekwondo, so it would not be necessarily good for me. Why? Relationships, you don't keep score. Relationships, you have to care about what happens to the other folks. And great businesses care about their customers for the most part. They care about their employees. And they don't see it as just a transaction. Look, sometimes you have to end relationships. We all know about that. But if you think about ending it at the end of every transaction, you don't have a relationship. And so thinking about stakeholders in this relationship logic is much more powerful than thinking about, gee, how can I optimize this transaction right now? Fourth idea, you can only think about this stuff if you're engaged. I remember early on in when I was writing my old stakeholder book, I had gotten into a letter writing contest in those days with the chairman of General Motors, and it wasn't a good thing. So the folks at General Motors invited me to come up and have a look, see what they were doing. And I walk in, I'm a pretty young guy in those days. And I walk in and there's stakeholder maps on the wall and people typing into computer systems and all kinds of analyses and all that sort of stuff. And I just looked at all this. I'm pretty flattered that anybody would do all this, from dealing with my ideas. And I looked at them and I said, you talked to any stakeholders? And they said, well, no, we haven't had time for that. And, that was pretty much the end of the day right there. Unless you're engaged in a boots on the ground way, and doing stakeholder analysis doesn't help you. You have to really be involved. You have to know some stuff about stakeholders from interacting with them. You have to think through the behavior that you want. What did the stakeholder do to help me achieve my purpose? What do they do to prevent me from achieving my purpose? What do they believe about us? What are their interests? Who are their stakeholders? And you need to think through those questions in a pretty rigorous way to be engaged. How does a stakeholder want to be engaged with us? Is often an important question as well. And you need to think through, well, what are the right questions I need to ask that I need to be sure about with my stakeholders? So more than shareholders and interdependent, no trade-offs, relationships, not transactions, stakeholder engagement in a real way. Finally, it's this idea that conflict, and a lot of people don't like conflict, but conflict is good. Where there's conflict, where you can find conflict, that's exactly the place where value can be created. I'll never forget doing some work with the tobacco company. And, the critics who wanted their company not to exist, that they were doing, everything wrong. And I tried to argue that there's a real different way to hear critics. People in the industry call them antis. The critics are the antis. And that's not a good way to get someone to sit down and talk with you, is to call them antis. I tried to argue, if you take this sort of stakeholder mindset, what the critics are telling you is that until you have a product that delivers the pleasure of smoking, and it is pleasurable for those of you who have been smokers, without the health risk, you just had a lousy product. And if you hear it like that, if you hear your critics telling you things, there's a business opportunity behind every critic. So these 5 subtleties, that stakeholders are interdependent, that we got to avoid trade-offs or look for win-win-wins. We have to see them in terms of relationships, not transactions. We have to engage with them, and we have to see conflict as good, are a great way to get into thinking about your businesses or businesses that you're interested in stakeholder terms. So what we'd like to do is to put you into small groups now and spend the first 5 to 8 minutes thinking about these questions. And there'll be a Jamboard or something in the chat to give you the questions. And then spend about 20 minutes talking to each other about your different businesses and the answers to these stakeholder questions. The question is pretty straightforward. First one's, who are our stakeholders that we're trying to create value for? Second one's, how does creating value for one stakeholder create or destroy value for the others? The third one is, what could each stakeholder do to help us achieve our purpose? What could each do to prevent us from achieving our purpose? The fourth one is, what makes each stakeholder tick? What are their interests? Who are their stakeholders? What are their beliefs about our business? And finally, what are the major points of conflict or tension among our stakeholders? And how do we avoid some trade-off thinking here? Again, we'll be sure you have access to that in your small groups. So I think we can move to the small group part now.
Yeah.
So is everybody who's who's here, does anybody want to be in a small group?
I think everybody left here is your support team.
Okay.
Livia or Alia, could you open my video, please?
Yep.
Okay.
Isabel, would you like to join a breakout room?
Hi, I was in a breakout room with only one other person and they're not able to participate. So if you want to pop me into another one, I will join.
Okay, will do.
Thanks.
So apparently we already have one question, Ed. It's a little off of what we're trying to do in this workshop, but I'll share it with you while the breakout groups are running. And the question is, you bring a good theoretical argument rooted in a good historical case studies, sorry, not off, but more than one. However, the historical paradigms have created the climate crisis. What do you propose society does differently? Our generation's problem is in order of magnitude more complex.
Okay.
I don't know if you want to address that as soon as we reconvene or have that thought in your head. I can.
Well, let's address it at some. Let's address it at some point. That's
Okay. Livia, in the chat, there's someone else who needs to be reassigned.
Yes, I see that. Thank you.
Thank you. So
It
I'm
was about the
looking-
right length of time, wasn't it?
perfect, actually.
Okay.
Because one thing I was thinking is if we have a hard stop at 2:30 and
Yeah.
we're giving them 20 minutes, so this is perfect. We'll be right back on schedule at,
Yeah, that's why I tried to make it
yeah,
shorter.
yeah, no, it was great. I made extensive notes and the notes are very easy to follow. So I think that if I could follow it, other people could follow it. I'm looking at some stuff. I'm preparing to write an abstract for a conference that I want to go to because it's in New Mexico, and who doesn't want to go to New Mexico?
Yeah,
And it's supposed to be around narrative and storytelling. And for the part of storytelling that I find interesting is the way we tell stories together in order to create shared purpose.
Mhm.
And how complex that can be if we're trying to cross divides. And so within Canada, we have the Truth and Reconciliation
right.
Commission, and then what comes after that. And one of the elders of the university, Dr. Reg Crowshoe, who truly is an elder and an entrepreneur, he talks about, he used the concept of ethical space and, really listening to each other and trying to find a way across the stories. And to me, what I see in the city, people say, well, let's get on with doing something. And it's kind of like they're forgetting the harmony part.
Yeah, that's right.
Because if we don't talk, we don't get to harmony.
And you have to find the vocabulary and find the right set of questions that people can be in. I've often said that what great leaders do is they figure out what questions they want their organizations to ask. It's
Yeah.
not about telling people what to do or even doing things. It's about getting them to ask the right questions. And that means getting a shared vocabulary so that you can talk to each other. I mean,
Yeah.
part of the political malaise is the lack of a shared vocabulary and the fact that you can use the internet as a giant echo chamber that,
Allows you to never engage, really.
yeah, that's
Yeah.
right.
Yeah, I kind of get a lot of grief because I actually deliberately try to mix up my feeds by mixing up who I watch. Sometimes that
Yeah.
means I deliberately have to look for certain kinds of podcasts. Like,
Right.
for example, very easy for a white person to suddenly discover there's only white people in their feed,
Right, exactly.
right? And that,
Exactly.
and it's not even that I want that.
Yeah.
It's just, it sort of happens. And so, yeah, it's interesting how hard it is to get multiple perspectives into your social
It's been
media.
fun. I've been doing this podcast called the Stakeholder Podcast, and we've done about 70 episodes now, and it's been interesting to be on the other side of the microphone to try to find these bridging vocabularies.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's what I'm thinking about these days. I'm seeing a few faces coming back. Could you pop it in the chat to if you need to be assigned to a group? I think the ones who are sort of here but not here are probably so busy with something that they're just waiting. And goodness knows I've been doing a lot of that lately, so totally empathize. No, so Olivia, I'm reading your chat and you're quite right. Don't worry about it. Just as long as people realize they can tell us if they want to go into a breakout room, that's all that matters.
Hey, thanks. I think Heather's sending them back, but they keep, anyway, we're trying.
Oh, and for the next phase, I think we should both have our faces on the screen, not just one.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes, we can do that.
Breakout rooms with how much time is left?
We have 12 minutes, I believe, left. Am I right, Livia?
Were you keeping time, Alice?
Yeah, it was supposed to be 20 minutes, and I was just looking at the clock after they started. And I thought this is good because we can reconvene at 2 o'clock and then do our final half hour together as we originally scheduled.
Yeah, so we can bring everyone back at 2.
Yep.
I would just give them a couple of minute warning
Yeah, that's a
Okay.
good idea.
that you're gonna take them back out at 1:58 or whatever.
Okay, thank you.
This is the part where it's nicer live because then you would wander around the room and
Right.
hear the snippets of people talking and sort of pick up on themes without actually interfering or being obvious about it.
I taught live last week for a week and it was great.
Oh my gosh.
I hadn't done it in a long time.
Yep.
And then we had a building evacuation.
Oh, wow.
This was in a building in Washington, D.C., where we're on the 31st floor.
Oh, you had to take the stairs down?
No, it was complicated. The elevator still worked.
Oh,
So
okay.
we piled into the elevators, even though when we got downstairs, you could hear the thing say, don't take the elevators.
But too late then.
Well, it turns out the way they ran the thing was they only broadcast the alert for 2 floors up and down of where the problem was.
Oh,
And we just had some people sitting by the stairwell, so they heard it, even though it was further down.
so they didn't actually want you.
It actually want us to evacuate, but
Yeah.
it pointed out some holes in the system. So it's a new building for us, so we have to work that out.
Yeah. Interesting, because we're doing testing here on occasion because we're building a new building, but the 2
Right.
buildings will be connected, and so
Right.
that very important, obviously, for the alarm systems to be integrated. And just when you're on Zoom, you don't have these these sort of fire alarm moments or practice runs or anything. So what kind of topics do you discuss in your stakeholder podcast? Are you just talking or do you have guests or how's
Oh,
that?
no. It's always a guest. They're about an hour, and I've had everybody from, I've had some students on, I've had some alums. I had an alum who was the head of sustainability and stakeholder engagement for a big power company. I've had 2 or 3 CEOs who are friends on, and a lot of people that have written about stakeholder theory. My son and I are doing it together. And so that's a lot. He said to me, if you really want to promote stakeholder thinking, you got to do a podcast.
Yeah,
And
that's true. They're saying the same with books. People really prefer audiobooks on average, and you get more traction if you have an audio version.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The only good thing about Power of And is there were no business books that sold during the pandemic. 0. And mine certainly was one of them.
Yeah,
that
interesting.
Didn't.
Yeah. I'm thinking of writing a business book. I've got it all mapped out in my head.
Yeah.
And part of me is like, but is that really the way forward?
Well, that's what I know how to do. So I'm going to do at least 2 more.
There you go.
And probably 3 more. So.
Yeah. Manfred Ketz-de-Vries, he was speaking at a conference a few months ago, and he said he wrote 6 books during COVID.
Yeah,
And I
oh, that's
thought,
wild.
yeah, I mean, some of them were fun and some of them more serious, but I'm an INSEAD grad, so I know
Ah.
Manfred Ketz-de-Vries very well, and
I
he
love-
had 2 really star RAs, so he can't fool
Ah,
me. That was a
I
team
love-
of 3 writing.
I absolutely love Katz. I don't
Oh,
know
he's
him
fun.
personally, but we wrote a paper based on a lot of his stuff on can you map mistakes in business ethics with psychological
Concepts?
things. Yeah,
Hmm.
yeah. And the answer is yes. I mean, we did. And
Really
it's
interesting.
yeah, and he's really fascinating. I
Yeah.
taught I used was it Money, Sex, Death, and Happiness? I taught that to MBAs for a number of years.
That's cool. That's cool. I was at INSEAD when the book Organizations on the Couch came out.
Yeah, that's a terrific book.
Yeah, and all the descriptions of absolutely dysfunctional families and how that manifested in the organizations. Yeah.
Yeah.
And of
Well,
course
I was a student. I did a lot of work on Freud and his followers when I was in grad school. So finding Ketz-de-Vries was a real gem for me.
Yeah, right up your alley. Yeah. It really like that. So it was fascinating book to read, but it was also interesting because I grew up in a lot of family businesses, smaller ones, obviously, but to me, that level of dysfunction wasn't so obvious. So my father was a bookkeeper and he had a lot of clients. One of them was an Italian family. And the 2 brothers ran the business. One was salesy, one was ops. So it was like, that kind of family dynamics thing. But then the brother-in-law worked in the warehouse, really menial job, but very high pay because their mother lived with their sister. And he had to put up with their mother. So you had this whole family dynamic.
Yeah. Well, it's incredible.
fun.
I did some work for a family business when I was at Minnesota, and the 3rd generation was the CEO, and the 2nd generation was still on the board and would undermine the 3rd generation, et cetera, et cetera. So my job was to go to the older guy, and I'm about 35 then, and tell him he's screwing up. And
Because
so
he's not giving space to
he's not giving
generation
space,
3.
and he's screwing stuff up. And so I was very proud of myself. So I figured it out. I said, I'm going to go to him. So I went to him and I said, Joe, how would you have liked it if your father was always telling you what to do and always second guessing what you would do? And I'm thinking, man, that's the right way to deal with this. And he said, I would have done what he said. I was a good son.
He outplayed you. He outplayed
And
you.
so
that's good. That's good.
Then I had to just say, well, Joe, you're effing this up really badly. And they ended up, and I had made the deal that, I'll tell them this, but you guys have got to find some professional counseling. And it turns out they ended up selling the company because they couldn't deal with the family dynamics.
Isn't that interesting?
And that was the right thing to do because
Yeah.
they would have run it into the ground.
Yeah. Well, I know of a local business where that happened, and pretty sad actually. The
Well, it's
business
hard.
was an institutional brand name and gone.
Well, it's hard because look, running a business is hard, and now you add the family dynamic on it. And my son and I are pretty good at telling each other, stop acting like the firstborn son or stop acting like the dad. But if we weren't good at communicating that with each other, it would be even harder.
Okay. I'm just noticing Mohammed Khan is saying no one is discussing in the breakout room, unfortunately. Oh, that's
Well,
interesting. Why wouldn't they
We've
do
taken
that?
care of that, Alice.
Oh, okay.
An old one. Okay.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you. Well, we can't control everything.
So we probably need to tell them
It's time to go. Oh, yeah, 3 minutes.
to
until-
either,
Yeah.
to put questions in the chat.
Yeah, I prefer to do it that way. Then I could, and if something seems really interesting and intriguing, I'll ask them to open their mic.
Sure.
Yeah, but otherwise we'll just run it. There we go. I'm going to guess that some breakout rooms were very lively and others were a little slower to start because that's human nature and what happens in life, right?
Happens in life and in Zoom.
Yes. So we have a local family business here that's 5th generation, and I visited with a current, this 4th generation. It's fascinating to see how they managed to completely reinvent the business every 30 years.
That's great.
And still the continuity. I was just
Yeah, that's
really
incredible.
impressed. So unusual. And especially since it's local, which means that basically they were among the first settlers here.
Yeah, right.
This is
Right.
new, from a European point of view, new land.
Right.
It's really interesting. Okay, then. The countdown is on. So are you going to welcome them back or shall I?
Why don't you?
Okay. Do that.
Hello.
It looks like everyone is coming back to join us. It's wonderful. Just a few more. And thank you for opening your videos. It's kind of nice to see faces. So when I turn my head, it's because I'm looking at you. It's not that I'm ignoring you. It's the opposite. Okay, let's get started again. And so welcome back, everyone. And what we'd like to do for this next half hour is to take any questions and or observations from your breakout room discussions. And what we're suggesting is that perhaps you could pop your questions and comments into the chat, and I will actually call out a few of you to unmute and to share your voice. But let's get it started, and I'd be interested in hearing and from you what you learned by actually thinking through the questions, and what questions arose because thinking through the questions actually made you realize that you don't understand something. So I've got our first question from Duncan Moore. Who is the arbiter of win-win? Oh, that's a good one. Who is the arbiter of win-win?
Well, at least I don't think of it as there being an arbiter. I think you're trying to find wins. And there's got to be agreement. And you have to think about win-win as not everybody's paid in the same currency. So there are always lots of different currencies that exist. And so I would say, look, if it's your business, you have to drive that. So maybe you're the arbiter in that sense. You're certainly trying to drive the win-win, but you got to have people on the other side who agree, or it's not win-win. And again, you got to think about this in relationship terms. It's win-win over some time. Again, I like to think about this in terms of personal relationships. And, we don't do, my wife and I, we don't do everything that I want to do. And we don't do everything that she wants to do. Over time, we have win-win. And sometimes that means, you give and you get. And so I don't think there's any difference here. But thinking about not how can I give customers less so that shareholders get more or the venture capitalist gets more, I think that's the kind of trade-off thinking that I want to avoid.
Maybe I could flip the question a little bit. So in an organization that's existed for a while, and we have, for example, some success, we can expect the leader to have some power in the organization, an actual power, but also perceived power. It doesn't really make a difference. And in that case, if you're the arbiter, how do you avoid making calls based on what you think is consensus, but actually nobody dares talk back to you? I think that's a real issue in a lot of organizations.
It is. And, I've often said most organizations radically underperform because there's not enough pushback. There's not enough questioning of authority. We know the Milgram obedience experiments and all the work in social psychology that says, look, if you're a leader and you want people to push back, then you have to make that happen. It's a great book by a friend of mine, Simon Sinek, it's called Leaders Eat Last. But Simon asks people, do you have the courage to speak last? Because if you're always the one that speaks first, generally people will tell you what you want to hear. The other distinction that I think is really important analysis is, a lot of people will ask for feedback, but that's not what they want. I can remember a time I'm the cook in my household, and I had made fresh pasta for my 3 kids. They were, maybe 7 and 10 or 6 and 9, or, they were little ones. And I said, so how's the pasta? Now, I didn't want any feedback. I wanted to be told what a great dad I was, how lucky they were to have a dad who made fresh pasta for them. And oh my, you're like the best dad in the world. What I got, but because they took it as a request for feedback, is there any blue box Kraft macaroni and cheese in the cabinet? And so we evolved this saying in our family, if you can't deal with the feedback, don't ask for it. A lot of people ask for feedback, but they want praise. Yeah. And that's an absolute killer for getting people really engaged in the business. If you want me to take on your purpose, the purpose of your enterprise, and yet I can't push back, I'm not gonna, when I think something's wrong. First of all, we're not going to create value. Something really is wrong. And second of all, you're going to lose. You're going to lose my loyalty to it. So I think that's one of the most crucial questions leaders can ask themselves: is how do I get enough pushback and dissent in things? That's part of the conflict is good mentality that has to be at work here.
There's a bit of a follow-up. I'm going to skip Mike Tim's question for a second and get back to it. But there's a follow-up from Tim Lip, who says, if the value a business generates for its shareholders is higher position in the human hierarchy, is stakeholder theory effective? So this is almost the same question, but more conceptually. So by definition, he argues hierarchy requires zero-sum gains. How do we know some stakeholders are not involved in invisible hierarchy games which create win-lose situations for other stakeholders?
Well, look, what I would say about that is I'm not sure how useful that vocabulary is. I don't think there are any zero-sum games in the world. And so, I think it's always possible to encounter somebody later in life. So I'm not sure thinking about that happens. Stakeholders can create win-lose situations for each other. That's true. And that just means you have to work harder at it. I remember doing a session with some Japanese managers some years ago. And I said, who are the most important stakeholders? And they said, customers, they said employees, and they said consumer advocates. And I went, consumer advocates, that doesn't make a lot of sense. They didn't speak much English. I spoke no Japanese. And I said, why? And they said, well, we want to know what's wrong so we can fix it. And I said, well, suppose you try, you go out and you talk to a group, but you just can't find a agreement. And they said, well, we would talk more until we could find some way to agree. And I said, yeah, okay. But you try really hard, but you just can't find an agreement. You tried hard, you can't. What would you do? And they said, well, we would just try harder until we could find an agreement. So if you define something as win-lose, you make it win-lose. You might not be able to find a win-win, but the very process of trying to find win-win has value. So, and again, I'm not sure how shareholders are in a higher position in the human hierarchy. I guess I don't really understand what that means. Alice, you have any clues?
Well, the only thing I really can think of is that as a society, we honor people who are rich. And I think we make attributions that they're rich because they're wonderful people. I'm sorry, I'm being a little facetious, but I mean in the sense of competent and that they know what's going on. And we do this also with celebrities who have, you're a celebrity actor or actress. Why in the world would I expect you to know anything about the environment? But that's how our society works. And so maybe in that sense, there's some relevance to this idea that we attribute greater status and greater knowledge to people.
Yeah, well, I would just say we shouldn't.
No argument from me, but it is a societal dynamic, I would argue.
It is, and you have to decide which of those dynamics you're going to buy into and which you're going to try to work at making optional. And so there's there's no magic here, whether you're a stakeholder theorist or a shareholder theorist, or, you think the world is run by little miniature goats. It doesn't matter.
Yeah. Okay, let's go to the next question. And we have one from Mike Timms. And Mike, I'm noticing your video is open. Would you like to open your mic and share your question?
Absolutely, Alice. So we ran out of time in our group, and we just sort of started on, especially in the aftermath of COP26, trying to think about the oil and gas industry, which is obviously a major industry in our part of the world here, and its strategies and how it fits into ESG and climate change. And I guess Ed would be interested in, what do you think about all this in this whole realm of adaptation, transition, and the very big issues of climate change and ESG? What's the right thing for the companies to be doing? And we started off sort of saying, and who are the relevant stakeholders, at national or global or whatever. So anyway, I'll throw that over to you.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Mike. I started working with one of the major oil companies in 1990 on the question of does it pay to be a green oil company? And this company went a long way, and then because of some management shakeups and leadership fiascos, it kind of lost its way. For a while, it did some pretty interesting experiments, and that's the way I think about it. I was actually in Calgary a couple of years ago, working with some oil and gas folks there, and you know, my argument is we need 1,000 experiments. We need 1,000 experiments. The oil and gas people need to be a part of that. They need to figure out how they can do at least part of what they do and not make things worse. And that's hard. That's a hard problem, and it'll never be solved if they don't try. I actually think I'm actually very optimistic about climate change. Not that it's not an incredible problem, but here's the way I think about it. This is my iPhone. Think about how we got from when we were living in the trees on the savannah millennia ago to an iPhone. Think about how we got to that. We had to invent vocabularies. We had to invent the vocabulary for metal. That didn't just happen, right? We had to invent the vocabulary for glass. And then we had to figure out how to cooperate together to make those things. And then we had to invent a vocabulary for all the physics and chemistry and stuff that goes on the inside of this. You know, what human beings are, if we let ourselves think this way, what human beings are is, you know, we invent vocabularies to solve our problems. And then we're able to cooperate together to make those things real. This is what's so wonderful about Adam Smith's rendition of the Pen Factory. It's not about the division of labor, it's about the cooperation that occurs with the division of labor. We are cooperators who can invent stuff to solve our problems. But we have to think of ourselves that way. If we think of ourselves that way, then we live in a world of abundance, but it's an abundance in terms of our creative imagination. We have a saying we try to teach our students here, and that is critique through creation. Critique something by creating something better. And that's what we need. That's why I'm so optimistic, knowing that there are thousands of people out creating businesses, trying to do something about global warming. And that's what we need. I wish I had more faith in governments, but I don't. I mean, maybe they'll come along and not do harm. Right now, I'd take it if they just would stop doing harm. And climate change will be solved by businesses, by inventing ways to, you know, mitigate carbon, by inventing ways to or sequester it, or by figuring out how to make lithium batteries without doing environmental damage, by doing those things, by thinking about clean hydrogen or clean energy or those kinds of things. Businesses need to be involved in that, and we need to give them all the incentives in the world to do experiments. I think that's the only chance we got. If we can't do that, then we better start with Elon Musk worried about going to Mars and other places to find a new planet to live on. You know, people say all the time, well, you know, to destroy the planet. No, the planet's going to be fine. We may not be here, but the planet will take care of itself. So I don't have any magic for that, other than to say what we need is thousands of people out trying to figure out what's a better vocabulary to make the world greener, to make business greener. And I see that happening. I see it happening with the generation of students that we have now. And so I'm pretty optimistic that we'll figure that out.
Maybe the next question then could be the one that I'm sorry, I don't know where it came from because it was passed on to me. And this is the question of bringing a strong theoretical argument with, you have good historical case studies for your arguments, but this person is arguing the historical paradigms have created the climate crisis. So what do you propose society does differently if the younger generation's problems is an order of magnitude more complex?
Well, first of all, I want to take on I have a theoretical argument because I don't. What I have is an argument that tries to make sense of how business actually works. It's not an argument that many people have realized. And so, like the Molière character who, in the novel that discovers he's speaking prose, I want people to discover that they're creating value for stakeholders and maybe destroying it too. And if they do that, if they discover that, then they can get a lot better at it. Because you can get a lot better at finding win-wins, etc. So this is not something I cooked up and went around trying to find a problem to solve. It was something that it made sense to me, just trying to make sense of what business did. I wasn't trained in business. I didn't have a business degree. I grew up poor on a farm. I had a PhD in philosophy, and I ended up at Wharton. Basically because my girlfriend was at Penn. Now the wife of 44 years, so that part worked out. But I had to figure this business thing out. And it looked to me like what every business did was create value for customers, suppliers, employees, communities, people, and money. Stakeholder idea was kind of in the air. And I started writing about it and talking to companies about it. And they said, well, yeah, that's sort of what we do. Right. But if you don't see that, if you go with the sort of prevailing historical paradigm that business is about the money and only shareholders matter, then you create a mess. Well, it isn't stakeholder theory that's created the mess. It's the lack of it that's created the mess. I mean, if you think shareholders are the only thing that count, I would call your attention to the global financial crisis, where companies doing that, erase trillions of dollars of value from the world. I am the most shareholder-friendly person you could ever say. That's right, shareholder-friendly. I think it's great to create as much value for shareholders as you can. How are you going to do that? You're going to have products that customers want. You have suppliers who make you better. You have employees who show up every day and not just there for the check. You're going to be good citizens in the community. If you're lucky, you might make money. So I think seeing stakeholder theory, if you like, as a theory for me is just tools. Ways we can solve problems, ways we can make business better. How do we deal with things like global warming? Notice I'm not going to say climate change, because climate's the weather. Global warming is we're all going to hell if we don't do something. And I think the vocabulary matters here. And that's why I want many of you to start companies that try to figure this out. This is, in a way, generations leave challenges for the next generations. Our parents left them for us. We'll leave them for you. And of course, this is one of the big ones that you have to deal with. The good thing is most of the young people that I know want to deal with it, and they want to deal with it through businesses. So that doesn't really answer the question, but that's pretty much the best I got.
I have a question from Mohammed Khan. Mohammed, are you able to open your mic and share your question?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Thank you. Yes.
Sure.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's really a pleasure for me to attend this. I'm based in Qatar. And this is something on social enterprise, something triggered to me whenever I was registering for this program. And since yesterday, I'm just loving this, to be very honest. The question is, I'm something who's looking for venturing into the social enterprise world, because I'm a banker for the last 20 years. And I'm just thinking of this as a great opportunity for me to look forward for something new to be done. So what I clearly see, there is always an opportunity. People have done some innovation. They talk a lot about what they have contributed to the society through those innovations, definitely, in technological world, right? And of course, there's always a cost to that innovation. And as a society at large, we bear that cost really at very high cost. So it's always about a right balance to be maintained. So maybe Ed can throw some light with his experience that, how to maintain that right balance and who plays the role around it, including all of us, right? But the governance in particular, right, they have to play a role there. So I just wanted to have some clarity around it. Where is the right balance and who does that and how?
Well, that's a great question. That's a great question, Mohammed. I'm not optimistic that government has a spectacular track record at maintaining that balance. In fact, I think in many cases, it's the cause of the imbalance. I am much more a follower of someone like Friedrich Hayek, who thinks that rather than centrally planning something like try to balance innovations, et cetera, we should let order emerge. Now, whether that works with technologies like AI, with Facebook and those kinds of things, I think is a really interesting question. The technologies, I would say part of the issue is the technologies have outstripped our ability to reason about the ethics of them. Think for just a minute about property. This is mine, it's not yours, I got it, you don't. But if what I have is my latest book on a PDF, you can have it for essentially no extra cost. It's just a series of zeros and ones. When more of our technologies become streamable as series of zeros and ones, the property as stuff idea doesn't help very much. And so we go to these great extremes to think about intellectual property. That doesn't translate very well across cultures. And try as hard as government wants to, it hadn't figured that out. And we don't have a workable system of that in my mind. So I'm not sure about that. I would rather see individual companies realizing that their innovations not only create value, but they also can destroy some value. That's not to say you back away from it. I'm glad texting pretty much destroyed people leaving messages on answering machines. That's okay. The answering machine companies need to adapt to that, and I'm sure some of them did. So I'm not worried so much about creative destruction because the corporate form is a form that lets you do continuous creation, not creative destruction. So I think companies need to get better, and we need to get better at trying to figure out how to reason about this stuff. And there are foundational notions of ethics, and that's why oftentimes we don't see the cost of things. We didn't see that coming. I learned a lot about ethics from my grandmother. We had no conversations about end-of-life technology. We had no conversations about peer-to-peer networks and sharing and that stuff. Why? Didn't exist. And so we got to get better at that. And unfortunately, this is where the political fragmentation, plays an important role. So I'm not so optimistic about our ability as a society to do that. I wish I was.
Thank you. That was
Thank you.
excellent. I'm going to draw us to a close here. We have a hard stop at 2:30 and all of us will disappear from the screens. So I want to thank everyone for joining the session. I think the conversation was excellent, and thank you, Ed. And a lot of food for thought here. So what particularly struck me is that, we're talking about social enterprise. We often think about small organizations and how do small organizations emerge and function. And of course, as an entrepreneurship professor, that's my jam. But it turns out that we all want to talk about the really big questions at a societal level and with big companies. So something to think about for all of us, because there's a disconnect, I would argue, in terms of what are the social enterprises today? They're small. They really, in general, are. There's not many big ones. And where are we going to be going with that? So after the break, there'll be an Ask Me Anything about social entrepreneurship session. Everyone is welcome, of course. And in this session, there will be a chance to ask the panel members about social enterprises and specific issues. And we have a great panel, and this is a monthly event for us, and that is now part of our Pivot on Purpose session. So thank you very much, and we will see you all there, and a big thank you to Ed Freeman.
Thanks, everyone. Alice, thanks very, very much. Take care. Take care, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.